All right. Well, thank you everybody for being so patient. By having that chance to make your acquaintance, I'm Mark Schmidt. I'm the executive director for the Falmouth Historical Society. And before we get started tonight, a couple of things. As you know, all our talks are brought to you by Martha's Vineyard Savings, Cape Cod 5 First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Mass Humanities. And also, while I'm mentioning it, one of our sponsors, Martha's Vineyard Savings, opened up their Falmouth branch today, so our congratulations to them. All the books that are on our tour are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth, so we hope you visit the local. If you would, a couple things. We want to make sure everyone mutes themselves so we can listen to our speaker. Please mute yourself. At the end, we'll ask questions. We'll use the chat feature down below. So if you would hold your questions till the end, and we'll use the chat feature. If you're not a member, we would love for you to become a member. If you are a member, we thank you for that. Just so you know, if you want to become a member of the Falmouth Historical Society, memberships right now, you get 18 months for the price of 12. So you'll be good through December of 2022. So I want to thank everyone for enduring a pandemic and supporting us. This is one of those speakers that probably doesn't need much of an introduction, but I'll do it anyway. Nathaniel Philbrick, you know him, you love him. He's a American author of history, winner of the National Book Award, finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And a few years ago, the Falmouth Historical Society began something that's called the Catherine Lee Bates Historian Award. And this award honors educators, authors, chroniclers whose historical scholarship has enriched the communities, their states, their country. It's named for Falmouth's iconic beloved daughter, who first lived and then vacationed in the Cape Cod town. In 1893, penned the poem America the Beautiful. It is my pleasure and my honor to announce that the 2021 recipient of the Catherine Lee Bates Historian Award is our speaker tonight. Would you welcome Nathaniel Philbrick?
Well, thank you, Mark. It's a great honor. Having met my wife, who was from Falmouth High in Falmouth, and spent a lot of time there. This is especially meaningful to me. And she's a figure who was really inspirational in all sorts of ways. So it's a great honor and great to be with you guys to talk about the Mayflower. And though I have to say, this is a book that came out back in 2006. And in the last year, we've had, the 400th anniversary of the voyage. It was a time of the Mayflower II has been placed back into launch. Found back in the Mystic Seaport. I was lucky enough to be there for that launch. And so for me, it's been something where this was a topic I was writing about, thinking about, researching for years at a time. Between 2003 and 2006, the book came out, and then I went on and wrote a bunch of other books. And now with the 400th anniversary, it's given me a chance to return to the topic many years later, and with the Mayflower II now back in a rejuvenated form. And so it's been a real turning of the circle for me. And I think this is a story that is truly iconic. It's about a voyage across an ocean to a new land that does not turn out to be the blank slate that the Pilgrims originally assumed it was going to be, that it was going to be much more complicated than simply moving their congregation that had been in Leiden, Holland, to another shore where they could recreate their British background. And so it's a story of cultures meeting, cultures for 50 years, living remarkably well in a bicultural community in Plymouth Colony between the Wampanoag and the English settlement, and then it all falling apart, breaking apart with King Philip's War in 1675. And so for me, there is obviously the story of the first Thanksgiving. And like, many traditions, myths, there's something to it. But there's more to the story. I think there is that remarkable bicultural community that was created in Plymouth that was really the path that might have been when it came to the future history of this continent. But then there is what happened with King Philip's War. And I think for me, it was very important to take it past the first Thanksgiving and to show what would happen to the next generation. And so it's a story that in many ways speaks to the America as a journey. I think we've got someone who isn't muted, but it speaks to America beginning with a journey and then becoming a complex situation of cultural melding, of fracturing, and moving on into becoming the country that we are in. And I have to say, it was after writing Bunker Hill where I began to realize that the story of the Mayflower and Plymouth Colony really set the table in many ways to what would happen with the revolution. I mean, this is a story that was just not self-contained in the 18th century. The sense of going it alone that was developed in Plymouth Colony, and as well as the Puritans in Boston, meant that there was insularity in New England by the 18th century. That meant that the resentment that would lead ultimately to the sparking of the revolution at Lexington and Concord, you could see that the seeds were laid as soon as the Mayflower left Plymouth, England, bound for what would become Plymouth Harbor. And Mark, it was my understanding we were going to be in a conversation about Mayflower, and I would love to field whatever questions you and the audience have, and take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know people have plenty of questions, and obviously, you touched on this, that one of the things that I've always liked about this book is you talk about them as people, that they had their failings, and talk about talk about the first encounter that they had, and coming up with the corn. That's always been one of my favorite stories of that, because I think it shows kind of the human frailty of the people that got off the boat.
Yeah, I think, well, that's a real important point, I think, because, there's a tendency to think of this as a clash of cultures, of, impersonal forces colliding. But the more I looked into it, these are people, just as you said, Mark. These are flawed individuals, particularly when you come to the English side, have no idea where they are. Original intention to sail the Hudson River. Somehow they end up in New England because they almost die in the shoal at Pollock Rip. And they end up searching for a home along the coast of Cape Cod. The voyage had been delayed by months. They had eaten through many of their provisions. They were desperate even when they arrived, and making it all the worse, they arrived months after their originally scheduled time for the summer. It was now, the late fall, winter was coming on. They were in an entirely new area that they knew nothing about. And so they come to they come to what we now call Provincetown Harbor and begin to explore the coast of Cape Cod, looking for a home, preferably where a navigable river would flow into the ocean, where they could get furs from the interior of the country. And as we know, there are no large navigable rivers flowing into the North Shore of the Cape, but they knew so little about the area, they weren't aware of that. And so they're working their way, feeling their way. They've seen some of the native peoples who ran away from them, pursued them, and now are making their way, over and if you've been to Truro, you know where they were. The Corn Hill is still there. And they come, they come across this hill, and they dig in and dig down, and come across the corn seed that the Wampanoags have dug stored there. And they know if they take the seed, it's probably going to anger whoever owns it. But they also worry, will the crops the seeds we've brought work in this alien land? Are we going to starve to death? Should we take some of it? And they did, and they're going back and forth, and they finally decide to take the corn. And I think that is a pivotal decision. It's one that is self-serving, obviously, but it's one made out of genuine fear and not knowing. It's not as if they're saying, we're going to ramrod our way through. This is something that they do with great fear and trepidation, and yet they go ahead and do it, even though it's probably the worst thing they can do for the future of English native relations. And so I think it is an episode that in many ways speaks to their humanity, their failings, but also speaks to the fact that they really didn't know what was going on and were fearful. They were just trying to survive. And in many ways, the story of the Mayflower is a survival tale.
When you were researching this, was there a character or characters that really spoke to you, that you really liked, that you really didn't like? As you're doing all your looking into this, who was a figure for you that you genuinely gravitated to or was repelled by?
Yeah, well, the reason I ended up writing this book was my reading of William Bradford's *A Plymouth Plantation*, which is one of the great works of American history. I don't care what century you're looking at. It's the book in which I realized these were not paper saints; these were people. And Bradford was a remarkable individual who, his faith was paramount in his life, and he would end up being the longtime governor of Plymouth Colony. And his book describes in detail what was happening. It's obviously from his perspective. Any narrative is from the perspective of the person who's writing it. But it tells a very complicated story. And there's a poignancy about Bradford's account. Things would not always go well when it came to their relations with the native peoples. In those first years, there was a brutal attack at Wessagusset, near where modern Weymouth is, led almost a commando hit, led by Miles Standish. And it was a disturbing incident that presaged so much of what was going to happen. And Bradford tries to, legitimize why they did it, but he also includes the letter they would write to their minister back in Leiden, Holland, John Robinson. Now, John Robinson was the spiritual center of the Pilgrims congregation in Leiden. He was charismatic, thoughtful, and someone beloved by the Pilgrims who came to Plymouth Colony. And I think one of the great tragedies of the story of Plymouth Colony is that John Robinson never made it to America, because he was the one who combined leadership with a spiritual sense of grace that I think could have tempered the militaristic elements introduced by Miles Standish. Bradford was somewhere in between. And what the poignancy of Bradford's account is that even though late in life, looking back, most people would look to Bradford's role at Plymouth Colony as a great success. Plymouth Colony grew from that one settlement in Plymouth Colony to settle much of the Cape, and towards what's now Rhode Island. But he saw it as a failure because as the colony grew, it lost its connection to the original spiritual motivation that brought them here. They were not that spiritual spiritual organism that they had once been in Holland. People were getting diffused across the land. Instead of God, they were more interested in making it, in getting their own farms, and he felt, a sense of failure. And so for me, Bradford was the one that provided a human entry into the story and a gravitas to it that made it meaningful and made it important. And I have to say, one of the great joys of researching a book like this is getting into the archives and, in some cases, holding the letters that were written and the journals and things like that. But it was holding William Bradford's copy of Plymouth Plantation. It's a calfskin bound volume at the archives of the state of Massachusetts. Was kind of overwhelming. Bradford did not write with to our eyes, the spidery scrawl of most Englishmen writing in the 17th century. He basically printed, and so it's this wonderful, easy to read. It looks like it was written 20 years ago, and it's all Bradford. And there, in some of the pages, is where late in life he was trying. The whole point of the Puritan approach to religion was trying to reach an unmediated connection to God, and he felt that, and the Bible was the closest we were going to get to that window to divinity. And so he was teaching himself Hebrew late in life so he could read the Bible in its original language. And so there, in his History of Plymouth Colony, are his writing out of Hebrew letters. And so, yes, it was Bradford who was not perfect by any means, but who embodied in many ways what was happening in Plymouth Colony during the years he was governor.
One of the things I loved about your book is you take it into the second generation too, and you talk about King Phillips War, which obviously is where we're located, of great local interest. But you talk about just how impactful this was, and ultimately it's as you put it, it's the bloodiest war in American history, given the size of it. What transpires between generation 1 and 2, besides the fact that there just becomes more of them?
Yeah, no, it's a really important transformation. I mean, initially, the English realized they needed the Wampanoags if they were going to survive. And in fact, if the Wampanoag leader Massasoit had not reached out to Plymouth Colony, they would have died that first year. They never would have survived. And the English had no choice but to recognize that. On the Wampanoag side, they had been devastated by disease in the 3 years prior to the arrival of the English. And their rivals, the Narragansett, had been virtually untouched. And so, requiring them to pay to basically kowtow to the Narragansett, and so Massasoit, with the input of Squanto, who worked a Wampanoag that had been abducted, spent some time in Europe and England, knew the language. With his input, and Massasoit decided, well, instead of watching this little English settlement wither and die. Let's see if we can create an alliance, and perhaps their technology, in other words, with muskets and other technological things, perhaps we can use that to create a sense of parity between us and our rivals, the Narragansett. And so it was a calculated decision on both sides, and they both recognized they kind of needed each other if they were going to retain, they're going to survive, and they were going to retain their integrity. And so the first generation understood this. And so in those first 50 years, it's not perfect by any means, but it is a remarkably bicultural community by any standard. And then things begin to change. As the next generation looks for land and begins to settle the Cape, on the English side, they wonder, they begin to view the Wampanoag not as allies essential to their survival, but the possessors of land that they want. And this is a very big change. And so the next generation is beginning to resent the native side. And then on the native side, the young warriors are saying, what good is this alliance that Massasoit has created for us? Because we're just selling the land right and left. The furs that initially allowed us to trade with the English have dried up. We're getting into an increasingly subservient point of view, subservient position, stuck in what was a virtual reservation in what's now Bristol, the Bristol area. And so the second generation begin to see it differently. And so it's interesting watching Metacom, otherwise who the English referred to as King Philip, trying to deal with his warriors and the English, and trying to it's a no-win situation for him until finally with Josiah Winslow, the son of Edward Winslow, who ironically had been the great diplomat of the first generation, who had saved Massasoit's life and really was the one who created the bond that made that first 50 years of relatively peaceful coexistence possible. It's his son who, as governor, refuses to have any sympathy for the position that Metacom is in, and pushes until conflict is inevitable.
Starting to get some questions in here. Would the Pilgrims be considered a cult by today's standards?
Yeah, I think they might very well be. These were people who came to America not for religious freedom, but so they could practice religion the way they wanted to. And I mean, I think it's an important distinction, because when other English from the Church of England or Rhode Islanders under Roger Williams, had Baptist beliefs or Quaker beliefs, they were not tolerated by the Pilgrims in Plymouth Colony and the Puritans in Boston. And they were very tightly, their spiritual beliefs were everything to them. And there was an intensity to it that I think was off-putting to those on the Mayflower and who later arrived that did not share their beliefs. At one point, Bradford, the Pilgrims did not believe in celebrating Christmas. And the English settlers, who were Church of England people, wanted to celebrate Christmas, which is what you do in England. And Bradford says, you can't do that. And that they were sort of astonished. Here in Plymouth Colony, we can't do what we can in England. And so that's kind of cult-like. What's interesting is you have John Robinson back in Leiden cautioning Bradford and the others to calm it down when it comes to the other settlers. The Mayflower Compact is a document that is justly looked to as one of those seminal documents in American history. And it seems to me it's in the language of John Robinson, and it's we're going to create a civil union. It's not completely a theocracy, and that's what would save Plymouth Colony from becoming a Jonestown. I think it was the fact that there were others who did not share their beliefs, but were, if not embraced, tolerated. This saved this community of intensely fervent spiritual people from becoming such an inward kind of cult that it became destructive. And so, they had the makings of a cult, but ultimately it became something more.
By the way, before I forget to, I first met Mr. Philbrick when I was working at the historic Winslow House in Marshfield, and he was mentioning about Josiah Winslow. It was always kind of a source of uncomfortability for our board, because we certainly reveled in generation one, but generation two left a little tugging on the collar. Why does it take a century for the revolution to occur following King Philip's War? Wouldn't the autonomy and experience gained from that conflict have driven the seeds of rebellion easier in the 18th century?
Good question. Well, what was I think the element that delayed it were the series of French and Indian wars that would be fought throughout the latter part of the 17th century after King Philip's War, and in the years preceding what is often referred to as the French and Indian War, now the 7 Years' War. There were all these series of frontier wars in which very bloody, and in which in some cases they required the helping hand of the British, although the New Englanders were always resentful that they didn't get more assistance. And so that delayed it. But what really was the factor was that Great Britain really let the colonists, not just the New Englanders, but all 13 of them, do their own thing. There was no real attempt to sort of control them, to make them pay the taxes that would ultimately spark so much. And so people got used to that kind of approach, that hands-off approach. Then comes the 7 Years' War, in the late 1750s and early 1760s, that this is this global conflict that puts Great Britain in immense debt, but is victorious for the British. They secure Canada for it, but that really is the beginning of the end, because now Great Britain says, wait, we fought this war for the benefit of these colonists. Now it's about time they start paying for some of the costs associated with defending them. And this, of course, did not go over well, as any New Englander and the Boston Tea Party, all of that. And I think it's a combination of the insularity of the New Englanders. By the 1770s, they have become very good fighters, because each town has a militia that has been regularly going out there for generations, defending the frontier, fighting the French and Indians. And so, in many ways, there are warrior people. Pennsylvania didn't have town militias, so it's a very different culture in New England. The New Englanders felt that, hey, we came to New England to get away from England, who were persecuting us for our religious beliefs. We made it ourselves. We defended ourselves. And now you want us to pay? The heck with you, and that's what it leads to. And so it's a combination of factors of, once the French had been defeated, there was no longer that threat to the north. So the New Englanders weren't worried about that. And now England wants them to pay. And so a lot of that animus is transferred from the French to Parliament across the way that wants to create these taxes. And so, once again, those seeds laid back in the 17th century finally come to fruition outside Boston, in Lexington and Concord.
The last time you came and spoke to the Falmouth Historical Society, we did it at the First Congregational Church, and I remember you had to get to the ferry on time. And a member on our board, Rocco Maffei, was kind enough to drive you. So he goes, your chauffeur Rocco asked did the colonists overreact to the King Phillips War? Because in the end, the Wampanoag were wiped out or relocated. Were they too heavy-handed?
I think so, yes. They were too heavy-handed from the very beginning of the conflict. It really did not have to happen that way. In fact, knowing the history of this country, you begin to think of it as inevitable. That's not how it was experienced at the time. The eruption of that war caught everyone by surprise, and I think a lot of it was the Plymouth leadership was getting kind of arrogant, and so was refusing to compromise, refusing to listen to Metacom, and inevitably, it all did blow up, and so it's a story that seems inevitable, but didn't necessarily have to happen. And I think when it comes to the war, terror gripped the English settlement as it did the native peoples. I mean, this was a conflagration that no one saw coming, that was much bloodier in the deaths per capita than the Civil War, the bloodiest war, ever fought in American soil. It was terrifying. So many English towns were burned and abandoned that they were talking, the English in Boston were talking about building a wall around Boston and surrendering the rest of Massachusetts to the Wampanoags and the Nipmunks and the other native peoples. It was that. And so that created this sense of terror that just fueled fueled a behavior that was, just going to make things worse. The decision was made to enslave the native warriors that were captured. This added to, this added to all this. And so it really got out of control to the point where from the English side, they saw it as a fight for survival. But once you began, when we have the hindsight to look and see where it was headed. They didn't see it that way at the time, and the slash and burn approach would really lay the groundwork for all those French and Indian wars I was referring to later, because without the buffer of the native peoples between them and the French and Indians in Canada, the English settlement for the next 100 years would be wide open to the attack, and requiring that the English, fight their way through the next century.
As a segue to that, I'm going to question here.
And one thing, thanks, Rocco. I really appreciate it.
Said Mr. Philbrick also seemed to respect and admire Massasoit. Could he comment on this Native American leader?
Yes, I have deep regard for Massasoit, who was a man who was put in a terrible position by. Hey, we've been through a pandemic. This has been a tough year for us, but it's nothing compared to what the natives peoples experienced for the 3 years prior to the arrival of the Pilgrims. I mean, these were 80% of the people in some communities were dying. Whole communities were clear cut. When Squanto returned to Patuxet, which is now called Plymouth, this community of 2,000 people was empty of native peoples. When the English arrived, the only sign of the prior village was that, you know, it was cleared, and the bones of the dead. You know, it was just a terrible, unimaginable situation. The Wampanoag were devastated by this, and as I said earlier, their rivals were not necessarily. And so, what to do? And you know, it seems that Massasoit's initial impulses were just to wipe out this pitiful settlement of English, but for complicated reasons, he didn't, and decided to, you know, create an alliance. And what's interesting is I mentioned that commando hit led by Standish Miles Standish at Wessagusset. It was a raid that Massasoit engineered in part. He was dying at his home in Sowams, in what's now Warren Barrington, Rhode Island area. He was despaired of. It was assumed he was going to die. Edward Winslow makes the trip from Plymouth to Sowams and administers to Massasoit and saves his life. Massasoit tells him of this plot at Wessagusset, and which leads eventually to the raid led by Standish. And this created bedlam among the native communities on the Cape and Islands. Once, you know, the word of that, it was feared that the English were about to, you know, launch similar raids throughout that region, and many of the villages abandoned their crops. There's mass starvation. It created a whole new dynamic throughout the Cape, and at this point, the natives of the Cape were, prior to this, were probably in numbers stronger than Massasoit's people. He had alliances with all of them, and liked to think of himself as the leader, but it was clearly an unstable dynamic going into that. But after this raid, a different kind of dynamic prevailed, and this was one in which Massasoit was playing a very complicated diplomatic game. The Wampanoag had a saying that a sachem was like a small bird that bothers an eagle. You know, if you've seen how crows will go after hawks, you know, and smaller birds will take on a bigger bird. That's what Massasoit was doing. He was the ultimate sachem, in that he was taking his position of potential weakness and using it for the strengthening of his people. And so, you know, it was, you know, you can look at it in many ways, but ultimately he was a very cagey, canny leader, trying to do the best for his people. You know, we look to what will ultimately happen. We know what will happen, but during his lifetime, he was doing what he felt was the best for the Wampanoag.
I like this question. Since you completed the book 15 years ago, what new insights and scholarships have come to light, which might be elements that you would include if you were writing a supplement to the book today?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, you know, I did the best I could back then, trying to tell the native side of the story, but was deeply frustrated by the fact that, you know, most of the evidence from all that time comes through the lens of the English, and you know, it's not as if new documents have come to light, but, you know, there's been a lot of scholarship in Native American studies and from the native peoples today that, you know, would would provide a different lens for me, but it's a book that was written then. I'm not going to return to it. It is of its time. I stand by it. And history is something that needs to be rewritten with every generation. And so, I gave it my best shot. And I've since moved on to other topics. It's one book in my ongoing attempt to sort of learn as much as I can about the story of America. And, I look back on that book and I remember the research trips, the trip my wife and Melissa and I took to Leiden, Holland, to England, to Scrooby, that's smaller than it was when William Bradford and Winslow were there, and drove out to Plymouth and all the places in Dartmouth and things that the Mayflower stopped on her way out, eventually across the Atlantic. And then those research trips on the Cape, following the Pilgrim journey to what would become Plymouth and the various places of King Philip's War. And so it was, for me, an opportunity to get to know the area I call home in a way I will always be thankful for. And it's a story that needs to be renewed with each generation. I gave it my best shot, and it's a story that I think is as important today as it was back in 2006.
The question here, basically, how can you compare, how does the Mayflower Compact can be put into relation to the U.S. Constitution? And also, what were your thoughts on William Brewster?
Well, I'll start with William Brewster. Brewster is a pivotal figure. He was really the spiritual heart and soul of the community, given that Pastor Robinson never made it across. He had a profound influence on keeping on. He was really the spiritual conscience and provided the glue for the community. So he was really important, and his kids were also important to the community. And then the question was, what about the Mayflower Compact? Well, it is not the Constitution in utero. It did not reinvent government from an English point of view. Things were pretty much the same as they would have been in any town in England. But what it did do, what made it extraordinary, was that it was written on a boat 3,000 miles from England, among 102 passengers, about half of whom came, who were pilgrims. The other half were Englishmen looking to create a new life in this community, in the New World. It created, as I said earlier, a civil law among a people who had basically lived in a bubble of theocracy in Holland. And so I think it's an essential document, but you cannot trace the Constitution is not descended from it. There's a whole different in the Enlightenment and all sorts of intellectual ferment would happen between the two, but it does set a precedent of a people on their own. Instead of looking to Miles Standish, their military officer, to subdue the rebels, because there were people on board who were threatening to, once they got to land, to go on their own. If that had happened, the community would have fallen apart immediately. Instead of subduing the rebels and demanding, that they do as the religious-minded people insisted, they put their pen to paper and created this document. And I think that makes it very important.
Um, I live in Plymouth, so as a matter of public service, I want to let people know that part of a question here that this coming Saturday there's a newly restored shallop that's being coming and back and brought back to Plymouth and tied to the Mayflower, and also one of our guests tonight, Karen Ronaldo, has done a painting that we have through the end of the year, the first Thanksgiving 1621. So I hope people come and see that. But somebody asked the question, and you wrote about them as people. Given their flaws, given what we know of them, are we right to celebrate the Pilgrims and the Pilgrim experience?
Yeah. Well, celebration, I don't know about that word. I think we need to memorialize it. We cannot forget it. I mean, I have a hard time celebrating our past because it's so complicated. You know, I know I'm flawed. I know everybody that lives today is flawed, and in the past, everyone was flawed. If we look to the past to think they were somehow better than we were, simpler, they knew where it was going, that's a fool's errand because it wasn't the way it happened. We can look back and see where it was going. They were in the middle of it. They had no idea. They were making it up as they went along. They made good decisions, they made bad decisions, but they did the best they could in the midst of their time. And I think that's important. It's a story that needs to be told. That's what history is all about. But, statues and memorial, celebration, I have a hard time thinking in those ways. I want to know what happened. I want to know what happened with all the darkness, all the light. I don't feel a need to look back and say it was somehow a better time, or they were all heroes. I think heroes is a term that's overused because all of us ultimately are just trying to make it through as best we can. And so, the term celebration is a hard one for me. The first Thanksgiving, I love the tradition of Thanksgiving because you're going to have 2 days off and plus the weekend, and it's a great time for family to get together. I really like eating turkey, and but I don't sit there and think of try to mind meld with the Pilgrims back there. I like to for me, it's history is something to investigate, to learn about, to explore, but to celebrate, I don't know. That's not where I'm coming from.
Just real quickly, somebody had asked this. Can you just give a quick explanation, the difference between Puritans and Pilgrims, and what relations did the Plymouth Colony have with the other colonies in New England and Virginia too?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and it's fairly subtle. Their religious belief. The Pilgrims came in 1620. They came. Their background tended to be relatively humble. They were not university men, except for a few cases. They came to Plymouth Colony. They were the first here. They had that cooperative relationship with the Wampanoag in the beginning of the settlement, they created the outpost, and then 10 years later, in 1630, comes the Great Migration. And these people came from East Anglia, a different part of England. The Pilgrims tended from the Scrooby area, which is more in the Midlands. And they also, and we'll call them the Puritans, coming in the Great Migration. John Winthrop was their leader. They tended to be better educated, wealthier, and they're better organized. And they came, ship after ship after ship. They were within a few years, they had left Plymouth pretty much in the dust. They take over Massachusetts. Winthrop sends his son to Connecticut, which becomes the other Puritan colony, and Plymouth becomes this, the old, almost forgotten originator of all this English settlement. And so they are different. And Winthrop and Bradford seem to have gotten along fine, but it was a very different attitude. I think what arrogance we see in Josiah Winslow was there even earlier when it came to the Puritans, and so it's a subtle difference. When the Quakers come to Massachusetts, they're hanged on Boston Commons. The Puritans were pretty unwielding, and it was a little less so in Plymouth Colony. I mean, I think to this day, it's different. The North Shore of Boston is very different from the South Shore of Boston, and I think it goes way back.
One last question for you. What are your, kind of going into that, what are your thoughts on the short-lived Dominion of New England, which briefly displaced Plymouth and Massachusetts colonies?
Yeah, it's one of those brief kind of what could have happened kind of things. I don't really have much to say about that. It was, it's interesting. There's so many what ifs when it comes to history, and particularly when it comes to the story of this region. And there were all sorts of attempts to try to do the revolution before there was a revolution. You just see that tendency coming. And even when in the midst of the King Phillips War, when English settlement after English settlement is burning, a emissary from England comes to New England to sort of see what the heck is going on, and the governor of Massachusetts, whose battle coat is still at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and there's a bloody spot of it. I mean, he says to this English emissary, what England can do is give us our independence. I mean, so it's a feeling that went way back.
Before we let you go, you have a new book coming out in September. Tell us a little about that, and what's your whole process? How when you decide to write a book, what goes into it?
Yeah, each book takes about 3 years. And I write these books not because I'm a great expert in the topic, but because I want to know about it. And I haven't found the book I'd like to read. And so for me, each book is a 3-year learning process. The first year is research, going on research trips, digging into the archives, and identifying who I want to focus on. And then in the second year, I begin to write. And it's with each chapter, the research process begins again as I dive into that specific part of the story. And so, 3 years later, I have a book. And so my current one is I've finished a trilogy about the Revolution. It was Bunker Hill, Valiant Ambition about George Washington and Benedict Arnold. And it ended with In the Hurricane's Eye about George Washington and the year of Yorktown. And when I finished that, I had become fascinated with George Washington. Part of me really wanted to know what happened to him next. And another part of me, after writing all these books, spending almost all my time in my office all by myself, researching and writing, one part of me wanted to get out and actually see the country I'd been writing about. And so when Washington became president, he realized he was the leader of 13 essentially independent states. He had to do something to bring this group of states together. I mean, when he was inaugurated in New York in 1789, 2 states, Rhode Island and North Carolina, had not yet ratified the Constitution. I mean, there was work to be done. So he decided he had to go out there and visit all 13 states and create a sense of unity. And he didn't travel by Air Force One. He traveled by horse-drawn carriage. He went as far north as Kittery Point, Maine, as far south as Savannah, Georgia. The southern tour was almost 2,000 miles, 3 months. And he visited more than 100 tiny little towns, all of this. Well, my wife, Melissa, had just retired, giving us an ability to travel like we had never had before. We'd just gotten a new puppy named Dora, a Nova Scotia duck tolling retriever. And Travels with Charlie is one of my favorite books, where John Steinbeck goes out with the standard poodle Charlie to find out what America is all about. And I thought, well, you know what? What if I use George Washington as my tour guide? I follow his travels as president with Melissa and Dora as my companions. And so Travels with George in Search of Washington and His Legacy tells the story of both George Washington's travels across this country, but our travels in pursuit of George Washington. And the narrative goes back and forth between them. It took us a year and a half to complete the journey of retracing Washington's steps. And it was an amazing experience for all three of us. I think, Dora had several hairy encounters, including one huge black snake just before we got to Charleston. But anyways, it was a new Washington emerged, not the statesman, not the plantation owner, not the general, but the human being, the traveler, And so that's what Travels with George is all about. It comes out September 14th. And I'm really looking forward to sharing it with readers.
Well, thank you for that. And just a quick aside, you can ask my wife. I always have my pom-poms out during the Westminster Dog Show for the Nova Scotia duck tolling. I love that dog. So well, you had me at hello on that one. So thank you very much for doing this tonight. Congratulations on being the recipient of the 2021 Catherine Lee Bates Historian Award. It's so very much deserved for all you've done. This has been a real honor and a pleasure. I apologize for the bottleneck there with Zoom at the beginning. It took about 10 years off my life, but I think we got through it. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you for doing this. Congratulations, and stay healthy, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Mark, thank you.
Thank you.